How are you? Oi.
Good. How are you?
Okay. So you are 1 hour later, no?
Yes, that's right.
How are you? How is the situation just now with the coronavirus in Russia?
I think you've probably seen the statistics.
Yeah.
We see the statistics too. We tend to understand that it's probably worse medically than what they say, but socially, everything started opening up again this week. And so if you're out on the street, it's almost as if there's no problem. And that really started from yesterday or the day before.
And does this bother you? Because there are a lot of critics saying that the figures they are saying they are not real, no? That they are manipulating a little bit the figures, no?
There is a lot of evidence suggesting that they're not counting COVID deaths as deaths. So if you look at the overall statistics of the number of deaths in general, this past May was higher than any month since 2010 when they had the fires and the smoke in Moscow. And the official COVID statistics do not reflect that. But in general, even if they were reporting accurately, I mean, even if they reported all of the excess deaths as coronavirus deaths, it would be a bad situation. But the hospitals really don't seem to be overwhelmed. And the situation here is not as bad as it has been in a lot of other countries. So it's worse than they want it to, it's worse than what they want to show, but it's not as bad as it could be, I guess.
Because I think they reacted quite quick, no, Russia? Because I was seeing it, as I'm half German, half Spanish, I think Russia reacted very quick, no?
They didn't. They spent most of March really ignoring the problem, but when they actually started taking it seriously, they took it very seriously, especially in Moscow. And when I say the situation is, not terrible, I'm speaking mostly about Moscow. If you talk to people in Dagestan, if you talk to people in some other regions, they are complaining much more. Medical workers are complaining much more about what's happening on the ground there. And the statistics there, of course, are even more difficult to understand than the statistics coming from Moscow, where everything is pretty well bureaucratized and there are lots of foreign journalists.
I wanted to ask you something because in the end, I wanted to ask you later, but now we're speaking about the hospital and so. There were some very strange events that there are some doctors and then there's some patients falling from the windows. Can you explain me what happened there?
I don't think anyone can explain what really happened there. It's obviously very suspicious, but all over the world, there have been instances of medical workers under serious stress committing suicide or trying to. Again, in Russia, when someone falls out of a fifth-story window, that's obviously suspicious, but I can't say. It would be dishonest of me to offer a thesis about what I think happened, because I don't have any evidence one way or the other about what happened to those medical workers.
But it also happened to patients. I read 7 patients that something happened similar.
I honestly haven't seen anything about patients. I don't doubt that that's true. I don't doubt that it's reported. I don't doubt that it happened. Personally, I don't know.
Yeah, because they were saying that maybe the medical that they were treated with some drugs or something, but I'm not sure. It was only strange because it was the doctors and then it was the patients and I was
right.
It was very quick. So my question is, this coronavirus came with a constitutional referendum that was planned. Can you tell me something about the referendum? What does it mean now?
Of course. And it's good to go back a little bit. And I'm trying to remember exactly when events occurred, because this whole year has been crazy in terms of events, in terms of news. But I think it was in February that a representative, her name's Tereshkova, she's the first woman in space. She's a deputy of the State Duma. She proposed that it should be written in the Constitution something about canceling the terms that Putin's already served, so that he would be able to serve 2 more terms. I think that was February. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the day that that was announced, Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, announced for the first time that the city was implementing some anti-coronavirus measures, precautions. And the precaution he announced was that they were going to be banning gatherings of 5,000 people or more. And of course, it's not a coincidence that he announced this the day that there was a reason for lots of opposition people to come out into the streets and protest something. So the constitutional amendments were announced. There was a vote announced that was supposed to happen back in April. But of course, the initial precaution, which Sobyanin announced, developed into some others, and not for political reasons, but for medical reasons. So towards the end of March, it was clear that coronavirus was spreading in Moscow. That's when we went into not a very strict lockdown, but there were regulations, and ridership on the metro went way down. People really did stay home. And because of that, they had to push the vote for the constitutional amendments, push the referendum back to an undetermined date. They also pushed back the Victory Day parade, which was going to be a big celebration. It probably still will be, but they took the virus seriously enough not to hold those big events. They set the date for the referendum as July 1st. And everyone understands that it's not a coincidence that Moscow is opening up this week in preparation for the referendum. It seems that the government, despite the fact that there are still 10,000 new cases per day in the country and close to 2,000 in Moscow, it's a stable situation with the growth of the virus, but it's not really decreasing very strongly. It's stable, and so they feel comfortable enough opening up, seemingly for political reasons, to show everyone that everything is fine. The government has handled the crisis, and now we can go vote on July 1st. It's political. It's not a medical decision.
Popularity as well, no? Because I read that he was that they criticized him that he was not concentrated, that he put all the responsibility of the mayor of Moscow and so on, that he was losing like popularity, Putin.
And he has, as a result of his handling of the crisis, as a result of the economic situation. Russia also did not offer much of a social relief package to people who were put out of work. Families with children got, I think, 10,000 rubles, which is now it's less than 150 euros. So because of the economic situation, Putin was losing popularity. And of course, yes, he did not take charge of the medical situation. He didn't want to be associated with this kind of negative event. And so he told governors that it's your responsibility. But interestingly, there's been reporting that Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, would have preferred to keep stronger quarantine measures in place for longer. It's been reported that Putin told him, you can't do that, that you need to open up this week. And the only explanation for that is that Putin wants everything to be good or to feel good at the time of the referendum. And of course, opening up Moscow helps economically. It helps really, the people will feel better because they can go out. And just personally being here, I understand that nothing has changed with the virus. It's as dangerous as it was last week. But seeing people out, I can't help but kind of, feel like everything is normal. It tricks me too. And so it's an effective political strategy, even though there's going to be a medical price, which we will pay in July.
But the people go out and they can protest if they want also or not?
That's an interesting element because starting last week, there was a journalist, his name is Ilya Azar. He went out and did a one-person picket and was arrested. This was when the quarantine measures were still in place, but doing a one-person picket should have been legal. he was arrested, one of the legal justifications for this was he was mentally aligned with other people. And so even though he was physically all by himself, this counts as a mass gathering. That's what they do here. That's how they justify things. But after that, some other journalists and activists came out, started doing similar pickets and being arrested. That was a story last week. We will see what happens in the coming 2 weeks if larger protests will gather. My best guess, and never predict the future in Russia, but my best guess is they will not, because there are still some social distancing measures in place in Moscow. So restaurants are not open. My banya, which I love, is not open. I have a group, we go there every Monday, and I have not seen them for 3 months. But while those places are closed, the government is going to be able, with some justification, they'll be able to say that the situation is not completely back to normal yet. And so, of course, you cannot hold protests. And they will cite the example of the United States, where, see, they had massive protests for the past week, 2 weeks, and their coronavirus case counts are going up. And so we can't allow people to meet together on the streets to protest the referendum. I think they'll find a way to hold the referendum in the way that is most beneficial to the regime. They know what they're doing.
One question: what is the one person picket?
I don't remember exactly where he did it, but this is a protest strategy in Moscow. When a meeting, like a protest, is not approved, people will either individually or sometimes together go in front of maybe the presidential administration building, and they will hold up a sign, saying what they are protesting. And sometimes someone will do this individually. And because it is not a mass gathering, you do not need a permit to do this. Sometimes they will do it sort of together. If you're standing more than, I think it's 5 meters apart, you're not technically a group. And so someone will hold the sign for 2 minutes, and then the next person will come up with their sign. So it's a common practice here. But this journalist, Ilya Azar, was arrested for doing something that should have been legal.
Now I understand. And what about the press freedom? Is there a lot of problems to give news on the government and news on the team?
As always, there are examples. So TV here is completely under the control of, there's no official censorship, but there's a lot of self-censorship, and all of the channels know what they're supposed to say. And the reason why they're allowed to operate is because they play the game. But radio and print is, and always has been, really free and open. There are some little exceptions. So, for example, there's a journalist named Yulia Latinina, and she gave an interview on Echo Moskvy a few days ago. Maybe it was even yesterday. And she's in some trouble. It's not exactly clear what the trouble is, but she's in some trouble because she cited overall death statistics for Moscow, showing that in May, they had around 5,000 more deaths than they normally do in a standard May. So sometimes there are consequences for people telling the truth on radio and in print, but in general, the government doesn't pay much attention to what people say there.
I was reading also that in Chechnya there were a group of doctors who were complaining and saying that the numbers weren't right and so on, but they said that it was they were forced to say sorry and so on. Is there more tension now with Chechnya?
I don't know specifically what the situation is in Chechnya. I do have a friend who is in Dagestan and is very well connected there. He's from there. He's not foreign. And he actually helped put out a documentary describing exactly what you were just describing. So that happened in Dagestan. I don't know specifically about Chechnya, but there has been pressure to report coronavirus cases as something else.
One question going before as well with this referendum. Do you think the population wanted it, or was it forced to be? Or I'm not sure how it's possible, because I read that the referendum Putin would be in the power until 36 or something. It's really long time.
So again, I'm coming back to my timeline. There were constitutional amendments proposed in February. Then this deputy, who is, kind of a hero, she's the first woman in space, suggested that as part of the amendments, the package of amendments, it would nullify the presidential term served by anyone who's already been president. So that, okay, in the Russian Constitution, there is a limit put on the president. He can only serve 2 consecutive terms. Putin is in his 2nd term. So this new amendment to the amendments would nullify the terms of anyone who's already served. We're having a new constitution, and so it will be like a new presidency. And so that would give Putin the legal right to put himself on the ballot in 2024 and again in 2030. So he could stay legally until 2036. Everybody understands what's going on here. And no, that proposal is not popular. And it's so unpopular that none of the advertisements for the referendum talk about it. So if you're going around Moscow now, if you're watching TV, there are all kinds of billboards and commercials about the constitutional amendments package. And just to clarify, when people go vote on July 1st, they vote yes or no. It's the package or it's not the package. You can't vote on individual points. All of the advertisements, they focus on maybe establishing an official status for the Russian language in Russia, or protecting the rights of animals, or one of the most controversial, not controversial in Russia, but controversial among people who watch Russia, is defining the family as, there's a man and a woman and there will be no homosexual marriage, and it will not be allowed for homosexual couples to adopt children. And there was a pretty controversial advertisement, which was actually blocked by YouTube, I think, because it was just, it was homophobia. Those types of amendments are talked about, discussed in advertisements. They never say anything about zeroing out the presidential terms, about how if you vote yes, this gives Putin the opportunity to stay until 2036. So the government understands that that is not a popular proposition.
Yeah, it's, so if I'm right, you wrote a book about Trump as well?
I did, yeah.
The people who vote Trump. So you have Putin here in Russia and Trump in America. Do you see similarities or differences, or?
Yes and no. This is, me speaking as someone who has lived in Russia for a while, who knows something about Russia, but I can't prove this. If there were an open political system in Russia, Putin would not be able to win any sort of election. He's never debated one of his opponents. If he actually were presented face to face with a competent competitor, he would look small. The reason why he has been able to retain power is because bureaucratically, administratively, the state supports him. It's not that he's controlling everything. It's that he's kind of the arbiter between all of the different factions within the government. And as a whole, they support him. But if there were legitimate democratic popular elections, he is not a good enough politician to actually be competitive in that sort of system. Trump actually is. Trump is not a characteristic, not a typical American politician, but he's effective enough to get just enough support to win power because of the electoral college system. Trump is actually much more charismatic than Putin. Putin is a much better manager. And I'm not saying he's a good manager, but Trump is really, really bad. Trump is not a great politician, but he's much better than Putin.
Okay, but this is a private thing, but I spoke to a cameraman who spoke to a lot of politicians in all the world, and they say that privately Putin was really nice to them.
I don't doubt that. I mean, it's not like there are a lot of people who do really bad things who are still able to, shake hands and say please and thank you to random people who they meet. It's not a surprise that Putin is nice to cameramen and janitors and drivers. I mean, that's fine. But when he presides over a country that secretly invades its neighbors and shoots down civilian airliners and then puts out lies denying it, I don't care how nice he is to cameramen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, this is what I thought. It was only strange, They were telling me, One question is, do you there will be a problem, I suppose, with the failing oil prices in Russia. How do you think will be the economical impact of it?
It will hurt Russia economically. Russia is pretty dependent on oil. That's what they export. But I don't want to, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to infantilize people here too much or, reduce this to something that's too simplistic. But Russian people really can survive without a whole lot economically. A lot of people have gardens. A lot of people have connections. And even if their income falls by 20 or 30%, people here are really, really good at getting by. They did it in the 90s. They remember that. My wife's parents, still have their friends who have potato patches and gardens. And even if there are pretty severe economic consequences as a result of the lower oil prices, they won't be worse than what they were in 1992, 1998, 2008, 2014, 15 even. And it's not going to damage Putin's standing as president of the country.
You lived also in China, no? Is there? We did the comparison with the States, now with America, now with China. Do you see similarities or differences?
I don't speak Chinese, and I was only there for a year. And so, I was more of an outsider tourist there, just kind of passing through. But I have a pretty high level of respect for the Chinese leadership. I wouldn't want to be a citizen of a system like the Chinese system. I wouldn't want to be a citizen of the Russian system either. But, I have to say this, the American system right now is not showing itself to be very capable as well. But that's kind of a different story. The Chinese political leadership is very, very professional. And I don't think the Russian political leadership is. I think the Russian political leadership is much more interested in maintaining their personal positions and their personal privileges. The Chinese leadership is full of corruption too, but at least seems to be more oriented on a strategy which will put the country in a better position 30, 40, 50 years from now. The Russian leadership is not interested in that. They're interested in really maintaining what they have personally for as long as possible. And that's it.
And what about the American now?
We're going to see. I said a while ago already that 2020 was going to be a bad year for the US. I actually said this on Russian TV on their like pre-New Year's program about what was going to happen. 2020 is going to be ugly because no matter who the Democratic nominee was, Trump was going to make this the dirtiest political campaign in US history. And then we had coronavirus and a massive protest movement, and things are only crazier than I expected. It's a sanity check for American society. Can we actually, as a collective country, nation, choose a path other than the one that we're on right now? And I'm not sure what the answer is. And I'm not sure how free, fair, and open this election is going to be. The votes are going to be counted accurately, but it's pretty easy to imagine that the election's on November 3rd. It's pretty easy to imagine that on November 2nd, every African American in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the 3 states that Trump really needs to win in the Electoral College, really easy to imagine that every African American with a social media presence receives some kind of notification that there's been a coronavirus outbreak in your area. It's not safe to go outside for the next 3 days. Stay home and be cautious. And of course, it won't say this was paid for by the Trump campaign, but it will have been paid for by the Trump campaign. Something like that is going to happen during the election campaign. I don't know exactly what, but we're in a dangerous place.
It's strange because it's just this year. I think it shows how global the world became, no? With the virus, now with the protests that are on all the countries, no?
Yeah. And the world was always global, but as much as some people, and I've always criticized U.S. foreign policy when it deserved criticism, but there are a lot of examples of the United States taking a leadership role. For example, in 2014 with the Ebola crisis in West Africa, and helping to prevent a dangerous situation from getting out of control. I would expect that if Hillary Clinton had been president this year, the coronavirus situation in the world would not be as bad as it is. Not only the situation in the US, but the situation in the world, because there would have been someone organizing an international response to the situation. And I think one thing we're seeing is what the world looks like when there isn't someone capable of playing that role. For all the problems that US foreign policy has caused, I wouldn't want to be in Iraqi. But it also did some good with that superpower status. And as it loses that, I think there's more harm than good done to the world.
Michael, the last question is, do you see something positive coming from this crisis and all the situation just now?
A crisis is always an opportunity. And it's cliche to say that, but speaking as an American, it has been really encouraging to see a lot of my friends and neighbors finally recognize some problems that have been present in the United States for my whole lifetime. I hope that we are able to use this opportunity to really look in the mirror and really focus on making the country a better place for everybody to live. I know I spoke a little bit about the global role of the United States, but the most important thing that the United States can do for itself and for the world is to continue to be an example, an imperfect example, but a pretty good example of what a society can be, a free, open, democratic society can be. And if we are able to look at some of these problems and find a way to fix them, that will have been a good thing, even though it's going to be difficult to actually do it. And we might not succeed, but we'll see what happens.
So thank you very much. It was very interesting. I hope that we can continue it someday. Yeah. Thank you. And stay healthy. And we will see with the referendum. We can speak later again, no?
I'm pretty sure that the referendum is going to pass, so we can talk about that when it happens. Yeah.
Okay. Katja, yeah. Goodbye.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.